At this breakfast webinar of FEPS. We are talking today about digital and climate in the light of our climate and mainstreaming project. We have a set of distinguished guests this morning for you. No croissants, it's a digital breakfast meeting, so we cannot offer you something to drink or to eat, but I hope that in your home or at your work you are making yourself comfortable for 45 minutes of interesting very exciting information on data and climate. Today we have Dr. Kirsten Hutte. She's an associate at the Alan Turing Institute and also and a researcher at the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the University of Oxford. She wrote for us a policy brief, which is also online, about climate and digital. That will be the base of her presentation. She will kickstart with a short presentation. Afterwards is Dr. Mauro Santiagnello from the UN University. And we have Anna Berti Schumann, Marie Curie Fellow at the European Commission Joint Research Center. Maybe first, if you don't know FEPS, we are a think tank here in Brussels. We are funded by the European Parliament to do research. And this is our breakfast webinar. Let's start maybe with Kirsten. Welcome, Kirsten. I don't know if everybody can see her. Yes. So thank you for being here this early morning. You prepared something, a presentation. So maybe you can kickstart, and good luck.
Okay. Shall I just share my screen?
Yes, please do.
Okay. I hope you all can see it. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. Thanks very much for joining. Today, I will present, as Gerard already introduced, a policy brief that I wrote for FEPS on mainstreaming climate and the alignment of climate and digital policy. I will start by introducing the topic a bit. So how can I go to the next? Oh, for any reason I cannot get, okay. So climate and digital policy. So why is this topic interesting? We all know climate change and digitalization are likely one of the greatest technology challenges of our time. And both transition happen today and we need to act on them, but they differ in some ways. So for climate change, we can say that there are existential risks. I think I do not need to talk much about it. We are all aware about it, and climate change requires immediate action and stringent action today in all areas, in climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, but also climate change compensation. And the challenge that we all face is to speed up this the transition to a low carbon economy and to rebuild our economy that it's aligned with the warmer world and hopefully making this world not too much warmer. And so the challenge for policy is to stimulate and to accelerate this transition by creating the relevant markets for green technologies, by stimulating innovation and through regulation. Digitalization is conceptually a little bit different. So when we think about digital technologies, so for example, computers or artificial intelligence, we often consider these technologies as general purpose technologies. And from history, we know that general purpose technologies can be engines of growth. They improve very quickly, and normally the transition can be seen as a self-driving process. I mean, we see it everywhere in our life. The digital products and services get more and more, become deeper parts of our life without so much of a policy intervention. It's largely driven by the market. But the challenge that policymakers face is not to accelerate this process further, even though we can discuss about it, but to alleviate undesirable side effects. So for example, market concentration of power in the hands of very few actors. We do not see it in the market, but we also see it in political discourses taking place on digital platforms. But also to avoid polarization. We know from the literature that digital jobs can lead to a polarization of income. So income being concentrated in the hands of some very few, and having an increasing number of workers working in precarious jobs. We also, I think we are all aware about it, and the European policy is already taking some action into this direction to fight and to prevent mass surveillance, which is much easier with digital technologies. But having outlined these differences between the two types of transitions, there are also commonalities, and the key commonalities is that these transitions happen today and we need to act on them. And we can shape both transitions. It's not happening, technological change is not happening by itself, but policy can and society can play a very powerful role in terms of what technologies we select and how technology transitions look like. When we look back into the technological history of other cases, we know that policy played a very powerful role in terms of selecting technologies and supporting and leveraging these technologies, but also shaping the way of how society adapts to technological change. Well, when we think about climate and digital technologies and how policy can act on it, we have certain things that we have to keep in mind. So climate and digital technologies, they can be synergetic, but there are also possible conflicts. So for example, digital processes are highly energy intensive, and therefore it might undermine our climate change mitigation efforts. We all know, or maybe some of you already heard about the rebound effect. That is the effect that efficiency improvements in digital technologies do not lead us to save energy, but just to consume more. So when we think back a few years ago, all of us just had one computer at home, and nowadays we have multiple computers built in our TVs, built in our phones, and also having a laptop and several devices. And this might be a driver of further consumption and further energy and material use. We also know that inequality and polarization that can be associated with the digital transition, that this might undermine societal support for climate policy. At least for the US, there are several cases documented where automation technology and areas where people live with a high job displacement, that in these areas you find very weak support rates for climate policy. There's another area of conflict which is more related to climate change adaptation. So if we want to make our economy and our life resilient against extreme climate events, we have to build infrastructures that are resilient, but digital processes are highly complex, and the more we become dependent on digital processes, so for example, for doing payments in shops, the more vulnerable our society may become against disruptions of these infrastructures. And therefore, we have to keep these conflicts in mind when we design policy that addresses both climate change and digitalization. On the other hand, there are also synergies, or there's a lot of scope for synergies. I already mentioned a bit the efficiency gains that we have achieved also through the help of digital technologies in the past. This may lead to a rebound effect, but on the other hand, it can also help us quite a lot to fight climate change and to save energy and to save materials. There's also another synergy in digital technologies have been associated with the rise of the service sector. So more and more jobs are moved, or the employment shares are moved from manufacturing and highly material and energy intensive processes towards digital services. And we know from the resource impact of digital jobs that services are by far less energy and material intensive than traditional manufacturing jobs. And this can also be a synergy between climate efforts and the process of digitalization going on.
Digital technologies can also boost innovation. So we know, for example, in biotechnology, a lot of innovation is not only possible through the help of computers and a lot of computing power. And there are many technologies also helpful for fighting climate change, which could be boosted with the help of digital technologies. And also for adaptation, there's a lot of synergy between digital tools that help us weather forecasting and which helps us designing smart adaptation strategies. And what I've done in this policy brief is that I have outlined 15 principles of how we can harness the synergies between digital and climate policy. And in the policy brief, I will not go too much into details now, but you will find 10 principles for climate change mitigation, 4 for adaptation, and 1 principle for climate compensation, where we may leverage synergies. And now I will just talk very briefly about, name a few examples before I conclude. So for example, for digital, for climate change mitigation, maybe some of you already heard about the concept of data spaces. Data spaces are the idea to break data monopolies by making data publicly available and to enable innovation, not only by the data owners, but also by groups with a justified interest. And these data spaces are thought to promote competition and to break digital monopolies, but we can also leverage these green data spaces to promote competition and entrepreneurship in the energy transition. But it may also help with sustainable finance, with sustainable mobility, and sustainable consumption, where we need a lot of information about the climate impact of our daily life, or for example, financial products. And this is a place where digital technology, digital policy can be well aligned to help our climate change mitigation efforts. We also talk a lot about job transitions, so that people need to be reskilled and reschooled when they lose their job in response to automation and in response to digital technologies doing the job that was previously done by human workers. And we think about a lot in the context of digital policy about reskilling programs. And whenever we do reskilling programs, we should keep in mind that there are certain jobs which will be needed that are urgently needed to speed up climate change mitigation. And whenever we do reskilling policy, we should keep in mind that there will be a big demand in the area of green jobs, and that these policies can be very well aligned to help each other. Just to mention 2 adaptation examples, again, the data spaces. Adaptation plans require a lot of information, and climate change adaptation policy is at a very, very infant state. Many local governments are still trying a lot of solutions, but data spaces can be also a very good place for sharing, not making data centralized available for about climate impacts, but also experiences that others have made. And I already mentioned the case of the example of infrastructure, digital infrastructure need to be designed in a way that it's also resilient in the case of extreme climate events, which are unfortunately becoming more frequent in the future. There's also the compensation example. So climate compensation is, we talk very little about it, but it's a very important dimension of climate justice. And it's also important to convince developing countries to actively participate in climate policy. And whenever we do any compensation policy or development policy, we should also keep in mind that these 2 transitions are happening, and that this would be that this needs to be thought in or built in by design whenever we do any compensation or development policy. And so we should focus on the co-benefits of both types of technology processes of technological change. Okay, I think this was a quick overview. I hope
Thank
you
you.
learned it, and I hand over to Gerard again. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. And I already have some questions that pop to mind, but I'm not gonna ask them now. I also want to motivate everybody, all the participants, to ask your questions in the chat, because the second half of the webinar we will make it as interactive as possible with a discussion between the different speakers, but also with questions from the audience. I would like to give over the microphone. We don't have a microphone, but I would like to give over the floor to Dr. Anna Berti-Suman. She is a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And it's interesting, your Sensing for Justice research project, to name one. I don't know if you're going to talk about that one. It's very much also about the climate justice and also the perception of citizens. So please, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to comment on this really thought-provoking brief. I think it's definitely very timely, so I praise FABS and definitely Dr. Hott for engaging with this topic. Indeed, I think the Sensing for Justice project and myself as a researcher passionate of the intersection between really technology and environmental and climate justice is really spot on to comment on these, because I think when we talk about the intersection between climate and digital policy, we need to grapple with the topic. We need to start with examples and applications. And the Sensing for Justice project that I funded 3 years ago now, in 2020, researches how civil society use digital technologies or their own senses like smell, sight, hearing, to demonstrate in judicial fora climate and environmental injustices. So really to demonstrate harms in a legal setup. I'm a scientist, but I'm also an environmental lawyer. So I understand how important it is to have evidence of climate and environmental wrongdoings. And it's interesting because it really gives an example of how digital and environmental can intersect. Indeed, it's interesting to think, and I praise very much the brief stressing the duality between the need of technology to address environmental issues, but also technology creating an issue for the environment. Indeed, the same civil society actors that use sensors know that these are energy intensive, they are creating electronic waste. And so basically when we try to solve a problem, we at the same time kind of create another. But I stressed a few points that I want to raise in this short commentary. So first of all, I think it's key to think in this duality argument that indeed Dr. Hott is bringing forward in the brief. And I also praise how technology can become key for change. But what I would like to challenge here is that I think the idea that technology is in self could be a self-driven or market-driven process kind of misses, and this is maybe a point for reflection or for improvement, the idea that technology is inherently socially constructed and that there are multiple forces that are actually shaping technology from below. Probably this is less visible because we see technology as run by big market actors, but at the same time, as a researcher that is always observing grassroots-driven technology, I can say that there are various movements, for example, the non-aligned technology movements that are trying to kind of break and rebuild technology to drive a change that reflects not Silicon Valley actors, but rather civil society need. And this is not easy, and it's also not new because, for example, Biker said it since ages, how really technological progress is never free from social influence. And I think maybe this aspect is something I would like to bring a bit more forward in the discussion. I definitely praise the importance of, let's say, how complex systems depend more and more on increased digitalization. So also, for example, the risk that relying even more on, for example, technology or grassroots-driven technology can make the system more vulnerable. But at the same time, I felt that there was an element, or maybe two, that were kind of missing in the discussion. One is really the role of civil society, which I praise comes in recommendations. So, for example, on the importance of sharing data and knowledge with civil society organizations. But I would have expected to see it a little bit before. For example, mentioning experiences like the one of tech-driven citizen science or citizen sensing, where civic actors and civic organizations are using tech and digital to shape and to have a say in climate and digital progresses. And maybe as an umbrella concept, I can mention the work of Lynette Taylor of the Cardiff Data Justice Lab, that is indeed the notion of data justice. And I think this notion is often being brought more and more in parallel with the notion of climate justice. And I think if we look at, and maybe I'm a bit biased because I'm a lawyer, so I'm kind of a believer in rights discourses. If we look at the climate justice discourse, it's inherently also asking for data justice and digital justice. And this is very much in line with Principle 9 that you mentioned in the brief, but also on the idea, let's say, that we don't necessarily need to rely only on official data, but also, for example, grassroots contributed data to inform climate and digital transitions. And when we start looking from below instead of from the above, we may also implement what people imagine as a just transition. And let's say shifting this paradigm from the way corporations shape digital spaces to how people are shaping spontaneously them, it's already a view to have a transition that is a little bit more sustainable, because it's really made, let's say, by the people considering their needs. And a big example was the after Fukushima 2011 disaster, where people started a massive grassroots-driven monitoring of nuclear radiation, building technologies to monitor radiation, but doing very decentralized ways. And just to conclude, I suggest, and I will just leave it in the chat, a report by the Engine Room called At the Confluence of Digital Rights and Climate Justice. I had the pleasure to contribute to it, and I think it really framed this notion well. And really, as a small takeaway, it's also maybe a broader reflection on governance. I think the notion of governance comes very often, but then my maybe provocative question is, do we want only central governance, or should we try to implement and support a decentralized, not only top-down, but also civic governance of this transition? And it takes time, of course. So thank you again for this brilliant work, and yeah, more to come.
Thank you, Dr. Berti-Suman. I think this is very interesting because we have space, I think, in the calendar also for some discussion. And when we talk about also the power of the big tech and the data that is there and the data monopolies, you are actually saying we could also from below create an alternative. I think that's an interesting thought as well for the discussion. But before we start the discussion, I would like to give Dr. Mauro Santaniello from the UN University the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to FEPS, the Foundation of European Policy Studies, Progressive Studies, sorry, for inviting me, and thank you, Dr. Hoti, for the very brilliant policy brief and the presentation. I will just focus on a couple of points that, from my perspective, I'm a specialist in digital policy. So the first point is that I like very much the idea suggested by the author that we should prioritize and select specific technologies according to our own goals and purposes, and especially when it comes to our developmental partnership with partner countries, for example. And on this point, I would say that, for example, we use as an indicator of digitalization the internet penetration, but we should break down this indicator, because one thing is to access through certain kind of technologies, for example, the personal computer, and another thing is to access the internet through a smartphone or a game console and so on. Social, economic, and political impacts. And for example, a smartphone enables certain kinds of uses like infinite scrolling of videos that are particularly impacting the climate dimension. And also smartphones enable electronic mass surveillance. That is a point that is well addressed in the policy brief. So if you look at the use of smartphone to access the internet, especially in Northern African country, we will see that there is a gender divide that is even greater than the official one if you look just at the internet penetration, because women are used to access the internet through a smartphone in a disproportionate way. And so if it is true what we have said about smartphones, we will have women subjected to mass surveillance in a disproportionate way compared to male. And the second point is that about the possible negative interactions between digitalization and climate policy. And the policy brief is very much effective in highlighting, for example, that digitalization relies on the availability of electricity. And I would point also that it relies on the availability of components like semiconductors, for example. And so the European Union has proved to be well aware of this and has put forward a proposal for a CHIPS Act, for example, and to face challenges coming from both supply chain disruptions and geopolitical tensions. But also this comes with an environmental cost, because of course we have exploration and extraction of critical raw materials like rare earth and certain kinds of gas. And this should be assessed, this kind of policies, this kind of strategies should be assessed also through an environmental lens. And so I think that it is very important to twin the two transitions, but also from a critical point of view, to question our goals and purposes according to what we are thinking about a just transition. So it is important that the European Union keeps its own values and principles and is also perceived as a coherent actor with no hypocrisy, because sometimes we show also to our partners, especially our southern partners, that we are a bit contradictory. I mean, we have some purposes that are, of course, linked to geopolitical tensions, to the economic factors and so on. But when we talk about human rights, human-centered transitions and so on, we should be consistent with this kind of purposes, this kind of ideas, because this is our added value. This is something that can help us to compete with other great powers, especially in Africa, for example. And so we should take advantage of this, but we should also commit ourselves to be consistent with this. Even this comes with some economic costs, and also if this comes with some tensions also with our partners. We know that, for example, in North Africa, some of our partners do not want that we propose political reforms, for example, in exchange of economic aid, and they want new politically neutral partnership and so on. But we should keep in mind that our real resource is this idea that we have fundamental rights that should be protected, and that this should be the framework for each kind of strategic goals that we give ourselves. So thank you very much for the presentation, the policy brief, and of course I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Santaniello. I repeat as well for the participants, you can ask your question in the chat. I would like to also go back to Dr. Kirsten Hutton also to give you the opportunity to react for me, it really stands out. I was triggered as well by Dr. Bertie Schumann about the bottom-up tech that's arriving. We had, of course, a discussion to prepare this and to work on the policy brief, but also to prepare this discussion. And we were really talking also about the data monopolies. So the big tech firms. And my question is also what Europe should do. In your brief, the green data spaces are very prominent. They come back, I think, in half or more or less half of the principles. You talk about the green data spaces. But how do you see this? How do you see this develop? Is it indeed a bottom-up data space that will develop, or do we need to do something about the data monopolies? And I also really liked as well the more international view and the resources, the materials that are needed to make tech, also the scarce, certain scarce minerals and raw materials. So please react on if you want.
Yeah. So being a bit conscious of time, I will try to bring all the points that were raised together. I will start with one very short comment on the scarce resources and the materials and the resilience of our supply chains. I think this is very well aligned with another synergy that we might find. So if we think about the circular economy, and if we want to take it serious, then of course we don't need, or we should keep extraction in Europe minimal and to reduce it to zero by making everything circular. And this is definitely a point where we can think the digital resilience or the resilience of supply chains for the digital transition very well in line with the circular economy, but also with resilience against climate hazards. And this is definitely the dimension and the way of how we should think about strengthening supply chains for digital products. And now I will speak a bit longer about society and how society shapes technology. And I will start again with one point mentioned by Mauro, and that is the indicators. So I'm an economist by training, and whenever we study technological change, we look at indicators. And indicators are very well available for markets and for the type of technology which is created by the actors in the market. And when we look at the literature, therefore, it's not too surprising that a lot of the economics literature that I'm studying at a macro level, that this very much focuses on market-based technologies. But for example, when we do research with patents, civil societies very rarely file patents. I mean, of course, there would be other data sources available, but they are not as conveniently useful or usable for economic research, and not so well established as the indicators that cover market-based technologies. And my idea while writing the brief was to emphasize that we can shape technological change. I admit that maybe the role of civil society was not as prominent as it should be, but by highlighting that we can shape the way of how technological change looks like, I wanted to make clear that technology is not something that is falling from heaven, from sky, but it is something that we can create and that we can actively shape. And Anna, you're totally right. Civil society plays a great role in digital products, and we would not have computers, we would not have so many computer programs if there were not many programming initiatives in the early days that developed these technologies by themselves. And of course, when we do policy, and I admit this point is not well elaborated in the policy brief, that there are also many mechanisms of how we can strengthen civil society organizations in taking part in the digital transition, but also in taking part in climate action in all areas. And for example, for climate change adaptation, it is clear that this is something which is very hard to implement top down, as there's so much local and very locally specific action required. But also for many digital solutions, there are for many mitigation solutions, there are local local actions that can be much more effective. There's one field of technology that was not yet captured and not yet covered, but which is also related to the very poor availability of data, and these are all the whole area of nature-based solutions, which are also very often driven by bottom-up initiatives. So nature-based solutions are planting trees in your street just to avoid to alleviate heat waves. And there's a lot of small stuff that can be done, which helps us a lot in climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, which can be supported by policy as well. I was focusing in the brief a lot on the big tech companies, as this is a big topic in whenever we think about digital policy. And Gerard, as you mentioned in your comments, data spaces could be one way how to break these data monopolies. So for data monopolies, we have the problem that it's when you once have efficient mechanism to collect data, just think about Facebook, Google, the data is privately owned, but there are mechanisms, legal mechanisms of how we can force them to make the data available. So for example, in the UK, I know there is the Digital Economy Act, and there's the possibility to force private data owners to make data availability if it serves the public good. But then it can be very difficult to prove what is the public good and to define it. I think, Anna, you as a lawyer, you should be very well aware that it's sometimes very difficult to make a strong case, but yeah, this is something we can and should work on, and also implementing laws that enable the courts to enforce data sharing and to make data available for the public, for not only for other firms, but also for civil society, of course.
And I think to add to that, so what you mentioned as well, like when it comes to adaptation, but also sustainable farming was one of the things you mentioned as well. And if the data is then concentrated with another big firm that's only selling that to big farmers, well, we might need small scale farming with a more sustainable data-driven solution. So we have to think about those things. Seeing the time, I would like to go to the chat because we do have 2 questions and I want to pose them both at the same time, and I give you the chance to respond. Maybe pick and choose, but I will give you all 3 also the last word. So we have Berta Michel as a research assistant from CEPS, is another policy think tank here in Center for European Policy Studies here in Brussels. And she was thinking the conversation linked naturally to the Beyond Growth discussion. There will be actually a Beyond Growth conference, I think next week, partly organized by FEPS. So that's a very much timely topic. So do join in if you can. But yeah, how does this link in? So that's a question number 1. I'll also pose the second question. This is from, if it's correct, I see Valiat Oloyede. He's asking, the lack of stable electricity in Africa is a huge challenge for digitalization. And Mauro, you mentioned that as well. But we have identified it, but how do we solve this issue on a continental level? Are there things that Europe should do if we think about digitalization in Africa? So maybe I think maybe Dr. Anna Berti-Suman, maybe you can get the first shot at the Beyond Growth or the other one, and maybe Mauro, you can answer the electricity. But I don't know, like how you see this. Is there a connection for you?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. Definitely is a huge question. I mean, just when I was working in the Netherlands, I could, let's say, advise a discussion on post-growth, which actually sounds very much the beyond growth, and working with economists. And I was the one listening to what civil society people or ordinary people really think about this idea of like imagining a technology that goes beyond growth. And here I would like to mention a concept that is epistemic diversity. And I had the pleasure to work for 2 years in Latin America, looking at how indigenous communities coped with oil pollution. And they use technologies, but very different the way we understand technology. So mushroom, fungi, phytoremediation. And I think the notion of beyond growth, and as Dr. indeed said, nature-based solutions can learn way more from cultures that have implemented and crafted and improved technologies in a way that is not based on a big, faraway market system, on polluting chains. So I think this idea of like not looking backwards, but actually looking around us, especially in non-European practices, also in a way to implement a sort of epistemic justice in the way we craft technologies. And we have much to learn, starting from what we teach in our schools that are very Western. So I think it's very precious to imagine this idea of beyond growth applied in Europe, but looking beyond European borders.
If I could chip in myself as well, I think like the market mechanism is of course like and the whole growth-based system. It's an old system. Maybe digital tools will make it available to do things differently and not only have the market guide us, but other ways. So it's something that maybe besides indeed as well looking to more traditional ways of development. Mr. Santaniello.
Yes, thank you also for the questions. And as for the question on how can we solve this issue of the unstable electricity in Africa, I do not have an answer. And of course, also because the effectiveness of any kind of policy initiative that we can take is dependent on very different factors. So it will be very complicated to draw a sort of solution right now. And I find very interesting the question about beyond growth, because I think that what we are witnessing, especially in the European Union, is a change in the framing of digital transition. It's not just an economic frame anymore. We have some concepts that are going forward. For example, this human-centric development of technology, digital sovereignty is another one, and the geopolitical assessment of digital policy. It is something that is new, and it is inconsistent with a purely economic frame focused on growth. So there is an ongoing process of change also in the discourse. And this could be a window of opportunity to bring in some new needs, new processes, and as Anna was saying, also new procedures and methods to think about our technological development, but also our policies about the mitigation of climate change.
Thank you, Dr. Santaniello. Kirsten, you have the floor for the final remarks because the time is almost up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one last comment on the point about Africa and stable electricity. I mean, decentralized electricity solutions, I think they are taking very well up in African economies. And I think this is the way we should go. And this is also the way of how we can think about aligning digital policy, mitigation policy, but also to some extent climate finance, climate compensation, which is where the EU should definitely play a greater role. And this is a lot about finance.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask you a final question, Dr. Hutte? If there's one thing the EU should do, what do you think? So you have a policy with 15 principles, but we are also focused on like European action here from FEPS. Is there one thing you would like to highlight? What is the avenue of work? Where should we push? What should the next European Commission do in this field?
This is
a difficult final question.
Yeah, European policy is complex, and there are so many small areas where small policies can have a huge impact. But I think the topic of data sharing and breaking data monopolies is one of the big areas which is the least touched upon yet. I mean, we know that climate change mitigation efforts need to be increased. This is clear, but the topic of data sharing obligations, digital policy is, I think, the area where we're just in the beginning, and data spaces, data sharing obligations. I believe this could be a very powerful way to go. Maybe not the only way, but something of how we can also promote civil society and smaller actors by fighting the concentration of power and innovation being in the hands of very few.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good note also to end this breakfast webinar. Thank you very much to the speakers. First and foremost, Kirsten Hutt, also for the policy brief. You can download this online. So this is the policy brief. It's a very interesting document. You can also check our website for future events. Like I said, the Post-Growth conference will be happening next week, but there will be more events. Also, Dr. Mauro Santaniello and Dr. Anna Berti-Schumann, thank you very much. Please also subscribe to our newsletter, because then you know every week what's going on. So thank you for attending, and